We've covered the successful form submission scenario. Now let's tackle what happens when things go wrong. In this test, we're going to verify that the error messages are displayed when you enter incorrect data. To do this, we'll be looking at the isVisible command to validate whether content is showing on the page or not. isVisible is similar to isExisting, except that it checks the visibility of the element. While the element could be existing on the page, if it's not visible, then the isVisible command will return false. To start, we'll create the test wrapper for our next two tests. We'll copy out the comments that we made and turn them into it statements. With our test ready to write, let's get to it. The first thing we'll want to do is load the product page. We already do this in the first test, so we can take advantage of Mocha hooks to create a before each hook that will load the product page before each of our tests, thereby removing the need for us to use browser.url in all of our tests. We'll go to the top of our file, add a call to before each, and move the browser URL statement inside of it. Now before each of our tests, the browser URL command will be run. Going back to our second test, let's get started writing our commands. The first thing we'll do is check that the error message isn't visible to begin with. While there'd be no reason for the error message to be showing, it's always good to validate your assumptions. Next, we'll try submitting the form without entering any content in the inputs. Finally, we'll assert that the error message is now showing. As I mentioned before, we'll be using isVisible for our assertions. We'll simply pass in the selector of the element we're expecting or not expecting to see, and it will return a true-false value depending on its visibility. One issue with our form is that it has multiple error messages, all using a similar class name. Instead of using a class name, let's use the text of the error message itself as our selector. We'll create a variable containing the visibility of our error message, then use the isVisible command and pass in a paragraph with an equal sign and the text following it to use the text selector for our error message. Next, we'll assert that isShowing should be equal to false. Just to make sure we've done everything correctly so far, let's run our test. Looks like it worked just fine. Next, we'll copy and paste the command for submitting the form. And finally, we'll copy our original assertion and validate at the end that the value is true. Let's run our test again and make sure that it works. As always, it's a good idea to reverse your assertion and make sure that the test fails to validate that it's actually checking the page correctly. Let's do that by changing the final value from true back to false. When we run our test a third time, we should see a failing error in the last test. Let's undo that change so that it works again. Just to show that we couldn't use the isExisting command, I'm going to replace the first check for isVisible with isExisting, and you'll see that the first test fails because the element exists on the page even though it's not visible. Let's change that back so we have a passing test again. In our next test, we're going to check that when you correct your input value, the error message disappears. The first thing we'll do in this test is to submit the form, triggering the error messages to show. Then we'll validate that the error messages are showing, just to be sure that everything's ready to go. Since we're looking at a different error, we need to update our error message text. We'll then update the value of our first input to something valid. Because the error message only disappears after the focus has moved away from the field, we'll need to add a click command to move that focus to the next form input. We'll run our isVisible check again and validate that the error is now hidden. Let's run our test one last time to see it pass. Looking good. We can do one final check that the other two error messages disappear by entering text into the product review form and hitting submit review, then running our isVisible command on both the main error message and the specific review text error message as well, and make sure that they're not visible. Back in our test, we'll set the value on the review content input field, and then submit the form. We'll then validate that both the error message for the main content and the specific error message for the review input field are no longer showing. We'll do this again with our assertions, checking that is main error showing and is content error showing are false. With this, let's run our test and see it pass. So that's how you can use the isVisible command to check the visibility of an element on your page to see whether it's showing or not, depending on the state of your page.